Hello and welcome. In this lesson, we are going to look at for loops for Python. So we're going to add a bit to our scripting capabilities by looking at this logical control statement called a for loop. The main reason we're going to use a for loop is to operate on any of our collection style variables. So that could be, well, in Python, that's lists, tuples, dictionary, sets, and strings. I'm only going to deal with lists, sets, and strings. There's enough here already, and honestly, those are the big three that you're going to deal with if you're running this as a system administrator and not as a programmer. The common thread between each of those variable types is they're a collection style variable. It's a type that has a name with multiple values stored under that one name. Whichever of these collection style variables we're using, the format for the for loop is going to look the same. It doesn't actually care which one we're using. It will be for some individual element name, so that's a variable name that we get to choose. I've called it item just because it's an item in our list. I suppose I could have called it element as well. And then the keyword in and the variable name that represents our collection style variable, whether it's a list, tuple, dictionary, set, or string. Then a colon and an indented code block. And that block of code will get run once for every element that is in that collection style variable, and then we can do something with that each item. So let's start off with a nice simple one, a for loop with a string. If you pass a string to a for loop, that block of code is going to get run once for each character in a string. And I realize as I'm saying this, I didn't set up a demonstration for this. So I'll just quickly write something up now, something nice and simple. I don't need sudo. I just need to vi string loop.py. Set up my shebang line, a quick block comment, a simple script to demonstrate a for loop with a string. I'm going to say data equals input, so we're going to ask the user for some data. Enter a sentence. And how about for letter in data.read, colon, indent, and we could print letter, and I'll do a count as well, just because. Count equals count plus 1. There are So it will just go through that string one letter at a time, count them up, and then tell the user there are whatever number of letters, if I can spell that right. And I really should be putting comments in this as a demonstration of good practices. And I'll just put in a comment, loop through the sentence the user entered, and print the number of characters in the sentence the user entered. I should explain what the loop does. Okay, let's find out if I made any typos. Enter a sentence. Here is a brand new sentence. I did make typos. Oh, because I was thinking os.popen, not input. I don't actually need to say read. Here is a new sentence. Now that I have fixed my error. And it prints it out one letter at a time, because it went through a for loop and dealt with each element on its own, one at a time, counted them, and prints out there's 54 letters in the sentence you entered. Trivial little example, it shows what a for loop is supposed to do. Run some block of code once with each element in our collection. Potentially, if we had run something with os.popen, and we will do this with an example in a moment, if the data we're getting back from our os.popen that we then call .readOn doesn't quite match what we need, there's a few different methods that we could use to manipulate that data. We could do things like split. This will be really useful if we're reading something out of one of the database style files that we find on Linux, like say etc password. So I've got an example here called user print. So what that is going to do is display information from etc password, and it will then break that up based on the colons so we can get some of the information out of that file without needing to look at it all at once. And of course we can have our script pick out what we think is important so we don't have to manually read that ourselves. So there we are. I just os.popen so I can grep home from etc password. So look at my list of users that have home directories. And there we are. There's that read lines thing that I mentioned in my video on lists and sets, that when we call os.popen, instead of just getting back one big string that has everything, if we call read lines, we get a list where each element in that list is a string that is one piece of text from that output, or one line from that output. And then I'm just calling .strip on each one, so I rip out the new line off the end of it. I break it up into a list in here based on the colons in that line. The name is the fourth element in that list. The user ID is the second. So for each one I'm printing out, that name has the user ID, whatever that user ID is. So before I even run this, if I just run that grep home etc password myself manually, it prints out 4 lines of output. Again, if I had called read on my os.popen, I would just have this one long string, but that's not what I want. I want to be able to deal with each one of these as a line on its own, so I called read lines, passed that into a for loop. Each one becomes a string as an element in a list, and then I can deal with each one on its own. So when I call userprint.py, it grabs a line out of that output, grabs item 4 or element 4 out of that list, grabs element 2, because remember it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And it tells me Peter Callahan has user ID 1000, and admin has user ID 1001, Norman Al user, or normal user, has user ID 1002, and Malcolm user, or Mal user, has user ID 1003. Now, I probably, if I was actually going to be using this, wouldn't be printing out that line current user is whatever, because that's more output than I actually want. I just did that so we could see each line as the loop goes through. And if I run it, boom, there are my 4 users with their user IDs. Simple, useful little information. And apparently that got a line behind itself. So yes, the idea behind a for loop with a list or a set is it will run the block of code once for each element that is in that list or set. So if we go back to my lists script from my lists and sets video, every time I wanted to print out every item that was in that list, I just said for item in my list variable. And it went through one at a time and printed out, this is the currently stored item. So while my list initially held bind and map policy core utils python utils httpd tools, when this for loop got to it, it would grab the first item or first element, store that in item, and print out the next value is, well, it was actually bind utils because we updated it, but whatever. Then, if we go down one line, I stopped indenting, so that block of text is done. It grabs the next element, stores that in item, runs my block of text with that element, grabs the next element, stores that in item, runs that indented block of text with that, for however many elements there are. And in this case, my block of code is very, very simple. I'm just printing, but this could potentially be something significantly more complicated, like when we looked at user print, where it's actually 5 or 6 lines long, which admittedly, no, that's not significantly more complicated. That's still quite simple, but if you can understand a for loop where we're doing this with it, you can understand a for loop where that indented block of text is 500 lines of code long. It's still the same basic concept. And again, sorry, didn't want to get to that slide. No, that is the slide I wanted. We did the same thing with sets. You pass a set into that for loop and it goes through one element at a time, repeating that block of code for each element in that set. And we're not quite done, because the last thing that I wanted to point out is an interesting feature of for loops. After Python has gone through every item or every element, everything it's supposed to do for that for loop, you can actually stick an else statement on the end as some final thing to do. So if I go back to my string example, I didn't need to actually do this as a piece of code completely separate from that loop. Good programming practice would say, that's closely related to that loop. That should be tied to it. So as a final thing, once that loop is done, now I will do this code. And then afterwards, there might be, sorry, that should be in Octothorpe, some other code that is not related to that for loop. Just whatever else is supposed to happen in the script afterwards. From the user's perspective, that's not actually going to change anything. They will still see this happen. The for loop happens one item at a time. The else still happens once. The user never really understands that we've made a change, but for keeping our code maintainable and easy for other people to read, using that else to be, or to indicate this is something that happens as this for loop ends, just makes it a little bit easier to read. So what we have looked at in this quick lesson is how to use for loops in Python, specifically with strings, sets, and loops, the common things you're going to encounter as an administrator when you run a command and it gives you some output back and you need to do something with each line of text from that output, or when you open up a file for reading and you want to go through that file one line at a time. Though admittedly, access to files is something I have in actually several other videos I've already recorded. But the whole idea behind this is very, very useful when we want to repeat effectively the same task, just with slightly different information each time. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.